At 4:45 on the morning of the 1st of September 1939, without formally declaring war, aircraft of the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, crossed the Polish frontier. The mission of almost 1,400 fighters, bombers and dive bombers, the systematic destruction of Poland. German Messerschmitts rapidly established air superiority, ruthlessly knocking Polish fighters from the skies, while German bombers pounded Polish military and civil targets. Working under the protective fighter cover, German forces were unleashed against the Polish army. The outcome was never in doubt from the start. In little more than a month, all resistance had been crushed, and the Polish state ceased to exist. Poland had succumbed to a new form of warfare, which would conquer most of Western Europe in the next 8 months. The Nazis called it Blitzkrieg, or lightning ball. The attack on Poland was a natural development of Hitler's hunger for conquest. He had already absorbed Austria and Czechoslovakia. Poland was his next target. Rivalry between the two countries had already soured relations, and armies on both sides of the German-Polish border were preparing for war. Planning for the invasion of Poland had begun in April 1939, when Hitler ordered the German General Staff to launch the operation known as Fallweiss, Case White, 5 months later. In many ways, Poland was an ideal theater for the new kind of combined arms operations being developed by the Wehrmacht. It was fairly flat, and therefore suitable for mechanized operations, while its long borders meant that the Polish army was overstretched. 1 hour after the initial Luftwaffe strikes, it was the turn of German ground forces to swing into action. Over 40 German combat divisions were committed to the Polish campaign. Providing the spearhead of the German invasion force were 6 panzer divisions and 8 motorized infantry divisions. These were supported by 27 foot-slogging infantry divisions. The main role of the infantry was to engage the bulk of the Polish army, while the German mobile forces raced round the flanks, cutting through supply lines and striking at command and control centers to the rear. The role of the Luftwaffe was to provide close air support for the German ground forces. However, German aircraft also played a more strategic role, striking at Polish airfields and aircraft, road and rail centers, concentrations of troop reserves and military headquarters. A number of Polish aircraft survived the initial attacks and put up stiff, if limited, resistance over the following week. But it was too little, too late. Von Rundstedt's Army Group South comprised 3 armies. 8th Army on the left drove for Lodz, while 14th Army on the right aimed for Krakow. In the center, von Reichenau's 10th Army had the bulk of the group's armor. Its mission, to pierce the gap between the Polish Lodz and Krakow armies, link with 8th Army mobile units, and push on to Warsaw. Attacking simultaneously was von Bock's Army Group North. Küchler's 3rd Army drove south from East Prussia, while von Kluge's 4th Army struck from the west across the Polish corridor. The attack was spearheaded by the panzers of Guderian's 19th Corps. The world was stunned by the pace of the attack. While German panzers crossed the river Wartha, Britain and France demanded the instant withdrawal of all German forces. In the face of the contemptuous silence with which this was greeted in Berlin, the Allies consulted on how best to implement their promises to Poland. A final ultimatum was sent to Berlin and ignored. At 11 a.m. on Sunday, the 3rd of September, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain broadcast the news that Britain was now at war with Germany. The world would realize, he felt sure, what a bitter personal disappointment this was. After all, Hitler had given his word not to attack. The campaign was planned as a massive double pincer movement. The inner pincer was designed to close on the Vistula River, surrounding the bulk of the Polish field army, while the outer, faster-moving forces were targeted on the Bug, cutting off any possibility of escape. The plan worked brilliantly. Never before had so much territory been gained in such a short space of time. After just 3 days of fighting, leading elements of the German army had pushed 50 miles into Poland. Whole Polish armies were in danger of being isolated. By the end of the first week, the Polish government had fled from Warsaw. In spite of some successful counterattacks early in the campaign, the Polish Air Force had been all but wiped out. German Stuka dive bombers were free to probe ahead of advancing panzer columns. The momentum of the German advance continued virtually unchecked. By the 8th of September, the German 4th Panzer Division had advanced nearly 150 miles, an average of more than 18 miles per day. By the same time, the Poles began to prepare Warsaw's defenses. The next day, initial German attempts to storm Warsaw were rebuffed. This was followed by a spirited Polish counterattack in the Buzura region, marking the start of the biggest battle of the campaign. But by now, the entire Polish army was becoming trapped inside an ever-decreasing circle of German forces. On the 10th of September, the Luftwaffe began to launch heavy raids on Warsaw, and the Polish government ordered a general military withdrawal to the southeast. On the 15th of September, the Germans issued an ultimatum to Warsaw: surrender or be destroyed. The garrison, supported by as many as 100,000 civilians, chose to fight on. Army groups north and south met at Włodawa on the 17th of September, completing the outer ring of the German double pincer. From this double encirclement, only a small fraction of the Polish army could hope to escape. And on the same day, even this hope was dashed. Surrounded and besieged, the Poles received yet another crushing blow with the news that Soviet forces had entered the war on the German side. Signed the previous month, the secret Russo-German pact called for the division of Poland. While the Germans crushed any remaining Polish resistance in the east, the Red Army advanced on two fronts, north and south of the impassable Pripyat marshes, meeting negligible opposition. The Polish government, which had already changed its location 5 times, fled into Romania. On the 19th of September, the Polish army in the Buzura pocket was finally defeated. More than 100,000 men were taken prisoner. 2 days later, the Germans launched a massive bombardment of Warsaw. The next day, the Soviets occupied Lvov, and with the Germans mounted a joint victory parade in Brest-Litovsk. A further ultimatum was issued on the 25th of September to the citizens and defenders of Warsaw, emphasized by attacks by more than 400 bombers. Polish resistance began to weaken, and on the 26th of September, the Wehrmacht launched an infantry assault on the city. Within a day, the Germans had taken control of the outer suburbs, and the Polish commander, recognizing a lost cause, offered to surrender. A ceasefire came into effect the next day, the 28th of September. To the victors went the spoils of war. The Soviet-German partition of Poland came into force immediately with the signing of a treaty of frontier regulation and friendship on the 29th. Poland, as a nation, ceased to exist. To seal his triumph, Hitler flew into Warsaw on the 5th of October, and took the salute at a victory parade. Organized Polish resistance ceased the next day with the surrender of 8,000 troops southeast of Warsaw. For the Poles, defeat was now complete. Despite the desperate gallantry of its soldiers, the Polish army had been outclassed by a superior force from the start. The fatal weakness in Poland's defenses lay in her lack of armor and mobile forces. At the start of the war, 30 Polish infantry divisions had been supported by 13 cavalry brigades, just 2 of which were motorized. The remaining 11 still used horses. For Hitler, the Polish campaign had been a gamble which he'd taken and won. The Wehrmacht had committed most of its forces to operations in Poland. No more than a token covering force in the west was left to face an overwhelming French army of 70 divisions and a small British expeditionary force. Although dangerously overexposed, Hitler had calculated correctly that the Allies would do nothing if he invaded Poland. Once the subjugation of Poland was completed in early October, Hitler was free to turn his attention to further campaigns in the West. To the peoples of Western Europe, it seemed that military operations had ceased. The fighting war was apparently over, and what United States Senator Borah dubbed the phony war began. Chamberlain called it the Twilight War, while the Germans called it the Blitzkrieg. Chamberlain refused to consider any deal with Hitler. He believed that in the spring of 1940, the German people would realize that they can't possibly win this war. They would undoubtedly rid themselves of the Führer. The Allies would then be able to deal with some other German statesman, such as Marshal Goering. Similarly, the French, and especially the French High Command, believed they were arguing from a position of strength. Following the end of the First World War, France had spent billions of francs on the construction of border fortifications known as the Maginot Line. Stretching from the Swiss border to the Belgian border, the Maginot Line consisted of a series of immense concrete fortresses. They were designed to be impregnable to conventional attack. However, for political reasons, the line did not extend along the Belgian border. As the Allies geared for war, French troops occupied the Maginot Line, while the British Expeditionary Force proceeded smoothly to their positions along the Franco-Belgian border. There, they built pillboxes and dug trenches. Both Britain and France still believed that war with Hitler could be avoided. There was no attempt to take pressure off the Poles during their ordeal by an Allied military action across the Rhine. This was much to the relief of senior Wehrmacht officers who knew that a thrust into the Saar could not have been opposed by the Germans. Further, it could even have sparked the anti-Nazi popular revolt of which Chamberlain dreamed. But nothing happened. Once the Poles had been beaten, the battle-proven German divisions redeployed swiftly across Germany to the Siegfried Line. Here they did nothing for the moment but glower at their opposite numbers and exchange insults with them daily through loudspeakers. The phony war lasted through the winter and into the spring, until German forces invaded Denmark and Norway, thus forestalling an Allied landing by a matter of days. German operations in Scandinavia began because the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, announced on the 8th of April 1940 that the Royal Navy were laying mines in Norwegian waters. The aim of this operation, which was a flagrant violation of Norway's neutrality, was to stop iron ore traffic between Sweden and Germany, which came through the Norwegian port of Narvik. But the possibility that British and French reinforcements and supplies might cross from Narvik into Sweden had already been brought to Hitler's attention. To the watching world, Germany's reaction to the Royal Navy's mining of the Norwegian waters, flagrant violation or not, appeared bewilderingly rapid, but it had, in fact, been planned for some time. In February 1940, Hitler had seen the dangers which Allied exploitation of Norway might hold for Germany, namely the threat to German iron ore supplies. He had also seen the advantages that possession of Norwegian ports would give to the Kriegsmarine. As a result, he had already ordered planning for what became known as Weserübung, Exercise Spring Awakening. General von Falkenhorst and his staff had been given control of the operation, and it was by sheer chance that at the end of March Hitler decreed that the operations would be launched at dawn on the 9th of April, the day after Churchill's announcement. The first step was the German invasion and occupation of Denmark. This was achieved in a matter of hours. By dawn the following day, German troops were swarming ashore at Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. At the same time, German paratroops seized Sola Airport near Stavanger and dropped later onto Fornebu Airport near Oslo. The Kriegsmarine ferried army units across the Skagerrak and Kattegat, losing 2 cruisers in the process. At first, only the Norwegian forces could offer any resistance, but before long an Anglo-French force had landed at Narvik, and British naval forces smashed most of the German warships in the harbour. Around Narvik, 2,000 German mountain troops were cut off from their supplies. They were driven from the town by the combined British, French and Polish forces, but the Allied success was short-lived as the ground troops were rapidly withdrawn to Britain. Elsewhere in Norway, the well-trained and equipped Wehrmacht, combined with the complete domination of the air by the Luftwaffe, ensured another victory for the Germans. For Chamberlain, the Norwegian campaign was a disaster. There were bitter attacks in the House of Commons against his policies of appeasement to which the government had clung for so long. The opposition railed against his pathetic optimism, both in dealings with Hitler before the war and in his attitude to Britain's defences since its outbreak. By 11 a.m. on the 10th of May, Chamberlain had accepted that he must give way to another leader, and at 6 p.m. Winston Churchill was asked by the King to form a government. In continental Europe, events were also unfolding rapidly. Early that same morning, Hitler launched his attack against neutral Belgium and Holland. The days of the phony war were gone forever. Shortly after 2:30 on the morning of the 10th of May, 64 German troops crossed the Dutch frontier. This was the spearhead of Germany's invasion of the Low Countries. 3 hours later, glider-borne troops dropped over the Belgian border to capture and demolish the huge fortifications at Ebenemen. The imposing concrete and steel fortress fell to a crack unit of Fallschirmjäger, paratroops, who landed by glider right on the roof of the fortress. At 5:35, the 30 divisions of General von Bock's Army Group B flooded forward across the frontiers from Maastricht up to the coast of the Ems estuary. To the south, the 44 divisions of General von Rundstedt's Army Group A moved through the Ardennes. This was the wooded country which French military commanders had proclaimed impassable for tanks since 1919. Setting out to prove this theory wrong was the main striking force of 7 panzer divisions under General von Kleist. Opposing the Germans were 20 Allied divisions comprising 5 of the British Expeditionary Force, 8 of the French First Army on their right, and 7 of the French 7th Army up on the coast around Dunkirk. German forces stormed across Holland and Belgium, supported by the full might of the Luftwaffe. Stubborn resistance by Dutch forces on the approaches to Rotterdam brought a brutal response. "100 Heinkel bombers were sent to attack the city on the 13th of May. In a devastating series of raids, they killed 1,000 civilians and made more than 70,000 homeless. Within a few hours, the Dutch government surrendered. The Allies were expecting the attack through the Low Countries and made their plans accordingly. But the 30 divisions of von Bock's Army Group B were actually a feint. They drew the Allied armies from the defensive positions they had so arduously prepared during the winter of 1939-40. By the evening of the 14th of May, the Allied line was formed as British and French troops moved forward to join the Belgian army. Movements were hampered by roads choked by refugees fleeing ahead of Bock's advancing infantry. Once again, the Luftwaffe was tasked with establishing air superiority and supporting ground operations. The Blitzkrieg on the Low Countries gave Allied troops their baptism of fire by Stuka dive bombers. Soon, they would come to associate the eerie, nerve-shaking howl from the Stuka sirens with death and destruction from above. The Allied defensive line stretched from the Scheldt to Namur. The northern sector was held by 3 divisions of the French 7th Army. The 50 miles southeast to Louvain were held by 13 divisions of the Belgian Army. Between Louvain and Wavre, the front was held by the BEF, and from Wavre to Namur by 6 divisions of the French First Army. Some of the battalion and brigade commanders were dismayed by the poor positions they now occupied, especially compared with those they had just left. If they were worried, the divisional and higher commanders were even more alarmed by events further south. They were only now becoming aware that Bock's slowly advancing army group was the lure to tempt them into a trap. This would release von Kleist's Panzer Group for the killing thrust through the Ardennes into France.